During the North American beta, Kodiak and I sunk dozens of hours into Lost Ark, an MMOARPG set to release in the NA and EU early in 2022. But is the game all that it's cracked up to be? Or is it another ARPG destined to be played then forgotten? Hey there friends, it's Livid here. Welcome to Legacy Gaming. Today we'll help you figure out if you should play Lost Ark. I wanted to do something a bit different with this video. Instead of reviewing the game, I wanted to take a step back and talk about each specific system, if it's engaging, fun to play, and ultimately how it fits into the grand scheme of the overall game. Now this is more about how the game plays and feels, not necessarily if something is a perfect system, so just keep that in mind as we move forward. The first thing that you do in pretty much any MMO is create a character. Now Lost Ark features 5 main classes, and each class has a number of subclasses which directly dictate their playstyle and abilities. Now I have to say I'm incredibly impressed with the diversity each class brings to the table. Every class feels distinctly different, in a good way. Oftentimes when there is a 2-tiered class system, those subclasses will share a base set of moves, and that's not the case here. When you play a paladin, you get paladin moves. That's it. This is definitely a more old school mentality. Now there's been a big push over the past few years for classless games, but having to make that concrete decision about what to play and committing to that choice has its benefits. Now this translates perfectly into the combat, which we'll talk about shortly, giving each subclass a distinct identity within the world. It's something we both loved about World of Warcraft back in the day, and something that we both find engaging as players. Now the one real drawback here is that figuring out whether or not you like a character can take some time. Now this is an MMOARPG after all, and that means you're not going to get all of your abilities right after creating a character. What I will say is that you get enough moves that you have an idea of the overall playstyle. You're not starting with a basic attack and say a fireball. You get a small handful of moves that work in harmony to at least present you with an accurate snapshot of how the character functions, but it still takes time to see how it all comes together long term. Now if you don't like a subclass, sadly there's nothing you could do other than re-roll a character. And yes, that takes effort, and some people might not like that. Once you pick your class, you get to customize your character, and while I personally don't mind if these are all chock full of features, or as simple as they come, I will say Lost Ark gives players enough control that I think they'll be happy with the choices. It's not the most elaborate system out there, but players have control over the important things like facial features, hair, and some more nuanced details. The one thing missing is really any sort of body customization. You're kind of locked into one predetermined build based on your class, and that does kind of take away from the overall uniqueness creating a character brings to the game. It's not a deal breaker, especially for me, but it's a layer that I think takes away from an overall fine system. Now once you create your character, it's time to start your adventure. And man, I forgot how much I enjoyed a good grindy MMOARPG questing experience. Look, there's no use beating around the bush. You're going to spend a lot of time running from hub to hub, talking to NPCs, killing enemies, and finding items. But it's a really seamless grind. You either love it or you hate it. And after the disaster that was, or maybe still is, the New World leveling experience, I have to say I really prefer this method of progression. Now where Lost Ark really gets it right is the flow from one region to the next. The world of Arcasia is relatively big, and each continent is home to a number of different regions and maps. You'll spend anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours questing in one zone, and I personally think that's the perfect amount of time to spend doing mundane tasks. Because the world around me was changing at a decent pace, I found that the leveling experience was rather enjoyable. What really helps is that the entire experience is grounded in a main story, something so vitally important to the overall pacing of the leveling experience. The Lost Ark story is pretty typical. A bunch of demons want to destroy the world, and you're there to stop them, becoming a champion of the realm and doing your thing to fight back the darkness. Now the thing is, that story is told well, enough so that I'm engaged whenever a cutscene comes up. Now a lot of this comes down to the incredible cinematic work by the Smilegate team. This is a great showcase of the type of stories Eastern RPGs are known for telling. But at the same time, it appeals to someone like Kodiak that doesn't often enjoy the more over-the-top anime style that they're often known for. Me, I'm a big Final Fantasy guy, so this really fits in nicely. It's a nice balance, and while not every character or moment is memorable, there are plenty of solid moments that got me excited. Now, a lot of players probably don't play for the story, and that's fine. but it's a nice anchor for the questing, and even if you strip that away, you've got a near-perfect system. The real magic is how fluid the entire leveling process is. You'll bounce around from hub to hub, region to region, and you'll never bat an eyelash. During our entire experience there wasn't a single time when I felt like the leveling system was out of balance. I wasn't going back to the same hub a million times, I wasn't backtracking over every little step I made, I didn't feel like enemies or quests were direct copy-pastes. Everything just felt really smooth. Yes, all of the standard quests are there. Kill 10 of this, collect 3 of that, but it's never a chore. The developers clearly understand that the grind isn't supposed to burn players out, and after my first round of leveling, I'll say that they absolutely nailed that. A large reason why the questing is so good comes down to the combat. Now, I've played a fair number of ARPGs in my day, and none of them, I mean none of them, even come close to this level of combat. Now that may sound ridiculous, but until you get into Lost Ark and experience it for yourself, you just won't understand. I also want to remind you that this video isn't paid for or sponsored by Lost Ark or Amazon Game Studios in any way, shape, or form. This is my honest opinion, so make of that as you will. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you start with a small handful of abilities, and as you'd expect, as you level up, you get drip-fed new moves to weave into your rotation. Depending on your class, you'll have well over a dozen moves, but you'll only be able to slot a certain amount. Now this means that builds are a thing, and because of the game's tripod system, things can get pretty deep. Now I should explain. When you level up, you get skill points, and you invest those skill points into certain abilities. When you reach certain point thresholds with those abilities, you unlock a new tripod tier. Now there are 3 for every ability, and while they don't drastically change the nature of a skill every single time, they're a bit more interesting than the standard plus 1% to crit. Now sometimes that's the case, but not often. Now I don't want to get too bogged down in the system here because what's really special is the actual act of combat itself. Talk about a polished and smooth system. I've had an absolute blast checking out the different subclasses and learning how to weave moves together like a pro. Kodiak spent most of his time on the Paladin, and considering our experience with that class in other games has been pretty terrible, we were pretty amazed at how much it felt like Lost Ark absolutely nailed it. One half swordsman, another half holy magic wielder, that you're able to craft a character that perfectly marries those two ideas together, and to a great effect. Then take a look at the Deadeye, a subclass of the gunner that I mained throughout the closed beta. It takes a completely different direction in the form of a high skill, stance dancing DPS monster. While most classes manage around 8 skills at a time, the Deadeye juggles 16, spread across 3 different weapons, each one with their own varied cooldowns and purposes in combat. It's a flurry of bullets and explosions, and honestly I was there for it. Now, will our piecemeal builds be the meta at endgame? Absolutely not, but it hardly matters during the leveling experience. And that experience, from a combat perspective, is amazing. Each class feels different, has a different pace of play, but everything is buttery smooth, incredibly animated, and impactful. And that's really the key. When I use a move, I want to feel that move. And sure, there are some classes that aren't super flashy, but for the most part, I think everyone is going to love the combat in this game. And I don't really have anything bad to say in this regard, and that's pretty incredible considering how many games that we've covered here on the channel. I'm sure I could pick apart little things here and there, but for the average player, there's going to be an immediate connection with the combat. Now to me, dungeons and raids are everything, and at least when it comes to leveling, man oh man did I really enjoy the dungeons. First and foremost, they all felt distinctly different, something that I really appreciate when it comes to group content. I also really enjoy the fact that the dungeons act as important beats to the story. They often anchored the end of a regional questline, and that makes sense. You build and build and build, and then boom, big dungeon, challenging content, and ultimately, a payoff to whatever you were doing in that region. It makes sense in my mind, and while not every dungeon was truly remarkable, there are some that will stick with me for a very long time. It comes down to 2 things, aesthetic and boss design. Killing hundreds of mobs is fine, whatever, but running through an elaborate sunken city, well, that's something special. Certain bosses really stand out as well. When you have giant demons that are designed to work within the environment, I mean, come on, that's just an incredible experience. I also appreciate that there are some really challenging abilities that don't coddle the player. Certain classes can take the big hits, but for most, fire is hot, and if you get caught in it, you're gonna burn, and you're gonna die. Keep in mind, this is just the progression content. Lost Ark has a reputation for challenging endgame dungeons and raids, and if we're seeing it on the front end, that can only mean good things on the back end. Now, progression in dungeons comes in 2 flavors, normal and hard. It can be completed solo or with a group of up to 4 people. This is some solid flexibility and prevents you from begging people in an area chat to queue up for a dungeon that no one is currently running. Is it more fun to run with other people? Absolutely. But when no one's around, it's nice to have the option. Now things do start to deviate and vary once you reach the endgame, but that's a whole other beast. Now I also want to quickly touch on scenarios. These are small story dungeons that you experience alongside your questing. I absolutely love these. They were more about story and world building than anything else, and were almost always enjoyable and coupled with some sort of over-the-top cinematic. This is where the storytelling and the action synergize the best, because you're experiencing these fulfilling moments with the story, but also getting to play out some really wild fantasy combat moments, like fighting bosses, sieging a castle, or taking on a whole demon army. It's something that I never knew that I really wanted in a game, but now that I've experienced it, I can't imagine games without it. Now, if there's one thing that's fallen flat for me and Kodiak, at least at this point, it's the life skills. This is the gathering and crafting aspect of the game, and honestly, it's just a boring, outdated system. You'll gain access to all your life skills about halfway through the leveling up of a character, and after going through the guide quest to learn all about them, we honestly couldn't be bothered. I mean, I hate that this is the case because I love nothing more than relaxing with some Netflix and chopping down trees, but it just doesn't feel good in the game. Now that can be said for all of the gathering life skills, they're just not fun. The same can be said on the crafting side of things. Everything happens at your Stronghold, which is your own private island, and it just feels kind of disconnected from the rest of the whole Lost Ark experience. Honestly, the entire Stronghold system feels kind of like a mobile game baked right into the base game. You have the option to send out ship crews on missions, add cosmetic and decorations to your island, and as we just talked about, craft. Now I'm sure there are useful things that we'll be crafting here eventually, but at this point with my experience in the game, I just don't care enough to invest the time and energy. I have no doubt that this will change once endgame progression becomes top of mind, but for most players that just want to experience the game, I fear this is going to leave a little bit of a bad taste in a lot of mouths. I think I can also kind of extend this to the ship navigation and combat too. At a certain point in progression, you'll gain access to your very own ship, and you'll use that to move around the different continents. The whole reason for this is that you can't use the triport, the fast travel system, to move between land masses, and that's where your ship really comes into play. It does add to the sense of scale and exploration, and there is some optional content that takes advantage of the system, like well over 70 plus islands to explore, but if you're not someone that ends up liking this aspect of the game, it'll be more of an annoyance than anything else. As a minimum, you'll have to use ship navigation to move from continent to continent. At the most, you'll partake in social events that happen on a fixed timer that will reward you with loot that feeds into one of the various endgame systems. It's overall kind of cool, but at the same time, kind of boring. Now it's really hard to try and break down everything in one cohesive video, because there are so many systems at play in Lost Ark. But honestly, that's kind of what you want in an MMO. Lots of things to do. Now if you find something that you enjoy and it's engaging, that's a win. The more we write and talk to you about the game, the more that I realize just how much there is to break down. So we're going to end with 2 more big concepts. And yes, we're intentionally leaving some of the smaller elements off the table in this particular video. The goal is to give you our impressions and a taste of what you can expect when you play the game. And hopefully we'll be able to break everything down in a more focused set of videos in the future. That'll be better for someone looking to understand every detail of the system. Now, no matter what multiplayer game that you're talking about, there is always those folks that want more PvE experience or more PvP ones. Now, Lost Ark doesn't have a vast array of PvP activities to get involved in, but what they do have is pretty engaging. It has a high skill ceiling, and I think there's a lot of familiar systems baked directly into player versus player combat that will attract a wide variety of people. Now, Lost Ark PvP action boils down to arenas. There are 3 options that will be available at launch, and they include Team Deathmatch, where parties of 3 go head-to-head and try to rack up the highest kill score before the time runs out. Deathmatch is a free-for-all mode where 6 players attempt to survive and kill as many of the other players as possible within a time limit. And Team Elimination, where teams of 3 send out 1 member at a time for more duel-style fights. Now, there's a lot to like about the PvP. Because the combat is already so solid within Lost Ark, it fits nicely in a player versus player setting. There's a lot of flexibility within the classes and the builds that you can bring into the arena, and that's something a lot of players are going to resonate with. Now, one thing that felt immediately important in Lost Ark was the ability to lock down targets with stuns and staggers, and chain together moves to keep certain classes completely isolated, unable to engage in combat. Now, it was frustrating at first, but you realize quick enough that it's a huge part of the overall strategy. Because Lost Ark's character identity is largely tied to your class and subclass, that adds another layer to the combat. You'll know what you're fighting, and overcoming your enemy will largely boil down to how well you know the moveset of your opponents and how skilled you are at your class. At the end of the day, there isn't a lot of variety in the PvP, but what's there is tight, and players that enjoy that sort of small-scale action are going to sink countless hours into climbing the competitive ranks and making a name for themselves on their server. Now, I'm interested to see if they choose to expand PvP in the near future, or maybe into something more large-scale. But for now, arenas will definitely check off some boxes for PvP fanatics. Now, when it comes to MMORPGs, it's all about the endgame. And while Lost Ark is technically an ARPG, it's clear that they're taking a ton of cues from the wide variety of games that have laid the groundwork for an incredible endgame experience. Once you reach level cap, the world kind of opens up, and you'll have to make a decision on how you want to approach the insane amount of content that the developers throw at your feet. There's simply too many systems, both big and small, to talk about in this video, so let's focus on the highlights. Now, the goal is gearing up so that you can take on the pinnacle challenges that the game has to offer. You'll start by doing things like Chaos Dungeons. Now, these are simply horde mode style encounters where you fill up a progress bar by killing enemies. Kill enough enemies, and you can leave the dungeon and claim your loot. This is a no-nonsense type of activity. You get in, kill everything, and get out. And while it may seem a bit boring, it's all about building a foundation of gear. Once you reach a certain item level threshold, you can start tackling the next set of challenges, Guardian Raids and Abyss Dungeons. At launch, these will be the most engaging endgame content available, but keep in mind that NA EU version of the game is roughly 3 years behind the Korean version. Now, that means more content is coming, and if you dig around YouTube long enough, you can find out for yourself. Now, Guardian Raids can most closely be compared to a monster hunt. You'll enter a dungeon and use an item called flares to track down the location of the monster in question. And once you reach them, a boss battle ensues. Entry-level monster hunts are pretty straightforward, with straightforward encounters and decent loot. But as you gain access to the harder difficulties, things really pick up. One of the great things about Guardian Raids is the fact that the time commitment isn't that long. You have a time limit to complete the raid, but most times things happen within a 10-minute window, and that's great considering how much there is to do within the game. Abyss Dungeons are, for now, the ultimate group content when it comes to challenge, rewards, and skill required. These are dungeons which you already know are awesome, and now are amped up to about 11. It requires intense coordination, a high personal skill level, and will really start to weed out the casuals from the more hardcore fans of PvE. Now, these are incredible, and while we didn't get to experience a whole lot of them, these are the things that make for great endgame loops. The dungeons are engaging, there are cinematic moments, and ultimately, you get a prize fitting for the challenge. At launch, NA EU players will have access to Tier 1 content, with Tiers 2 and 3 coming sometime later. Now, that includes a new form of larger group content, raids. We didn't get to experience those during our time with the beta, but man, just a quick look and you can tell that these are going to be a serious challenge, requiring coordination and the group skill to overcome some of the toughest obstacles in the game. The endgame is sprawling, and with a number of other more casual systems like Chaos Gates, Island Exploration, and more, I'm hard-pressed to believe that you'll ever really run out of things to do. And with years of endgame content already developed and released in the Korean version of the game, the experience is likely never to get dull. We started this video by asking the question, is Lost Ark worth playing? And to be frank with you all, yes, this game is absolutely worth picking up. And here's the best thing, it's free to play. And Smilegate and Amazon have already made it clear in blog posts and on Twitter that pay to win and pay for convenience features will be stripped out of the North American release. Now, these are all good things, but we can't forget about why we actually enjoy the game, the gameplay. Lost Ark is damn fun to play, includes engaging systems, and ultimately has an endgame that we believe in. Tens of thousands of fans across the world already play this game on a daily basis. And it's not hard to look up some more reviews around the internet and just see how beloved this game truly is. The best thing is that there are no signs of this game slowing down, and with new content being released constantly, all indicators point towards a massive launch and an incredible game when it does finally arrive in NA and EU. Now, hopefully this video helped you figure out if you might want to play Lost Ark. If it did, do me a solid and hit that thumbs up and consider subscribing. It's still the best way to help channels like ours reach new audiences. I'm also excited to announce that Legacy Gaming will be forming a Lost Ark guild on day one. We've already welcomed dozens of new members into the fold over the course of the beta, but there is always room for new recruits, so be sure to join us on Discord and get hooked into our Lost Ark community. Finally, if you guys like everything that we're doing here at Legacy Gaming and you want to support us just a little bit more, you can now do so by becoming a member. For just a couple bucks, you're helping evolve the channel and you help take our community to the next level. So check out the join button below to learn more. My name is Livid, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching and play on.